Welcome back, Myrmidons, to another episode of Greek Mythology Retold Podcast. I had the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dr. Emily Hauser, a Yale and Harvard-trained classicist and senior lecturer in classics and ancient history at the University of Exeter, and the author of the newly released Penelope's Bones. Here's my copy right here. Isn't that beautiful? Look at that. In the UK, it's released under Mythica and it has a blue cover, but here in the United States, you're going to find it in this gorgeous orange and brown cover, Penelope's Bones. It is a powerful nonfiction work that brings women of the Bronze Age into sharper focus. In each chapter, Dr. Hauser weaves together archaeology, myth, and historical research to explore the lives of mythological women like Andromache, Penelope, Briseis, and of course, my favorite goddess mother, Thetis herself. Today's episode has been one I have been dying to share with you. We deep dive into Thetis, not just as the mother of Achilles, but as a divine figure navigating love, grief, and fate through the lens of motherhood. We talk about everything from Homer to historical traumas of motherhood and children to myth and how it continues to resonate for us today. This is the kind of conversation that I created this podcast for, and I'm really thrilled to bring it to you. Now, before we jump in, I want to add that if you love mythological fiction the way that I do, or as much as I do, Dr. Hauser is also the author of some fiction books, and I will share with you the ones that I have in my possession. This one I love. This was my first introduction to her as an author. This is For the Most Beautiful. This is a Trojan War retelling from the perspective of Briseis. So there's this one. She also wrote For the Winner. This is a retelling of Atalanta, and there's another one that I don't own, but it's called For the Immortal. For the Immortal, and it is a story about the Amazons. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. And here's my conversation with Dr. Emily Hauser. All right, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
All right, great. I just want to make sure I didn't do anything funky. We're talking about Penelope's Bones, the new book by Dr. Emily Hauser. And I was wondering if you could just tell us what prompted you to, how did this book come about? Because
there's a lot in there, right? It's
that's a big question.
it's a big question, but I think in a lot of ways this book is quite obvious if you look at kind of where I've come from. It didn't feel kind of obvious when I had the idea, but it brings together a lot of different strands of kind of who I am and where I've come from. Because I have been very lucky to have had a long traditional kind of career in classics and ancient history. And so I've kind of gone through like the kind of undergraduate training, PhD at Yale, postdoc at Harvard. Now I'm an academic in the UK. And combining that with the fact that I also have this side in fiction, I've done 3 novels that retell the women of Greek myth. And, yes, there they are.
I'm on opposite the camera. It's like, right there.
But it was really just like those 2 sides of me coming together in this book because it was like, how can we use those tools that we have as scholars, as academics, as archaeologists and historians to look at the past, but how can we combine that with a narrative that doesn't just say, right, this object was found here and then another one was found here, but it links them together and it gets at the people behind the story and particularly the women behind the story. That has been an abiding concern for me throughout the novels and the academic work. Is how do we recover the lost women of history and of myth? And so I felt that bringing those questions together and actually saying, well, why don't we use the tools of archaeology and history, but write it in a way that makes you feel like these are people who are experiencing the objects that we're talking about, or in some cases, people who these are actually their bones, their teeth that we're talking about. How can we draw the narrative out of that? And then make us realize that these are very real women having real experiences. They have a huge history to tell. And we can weave those together with everything that we know about ancient history, everything we know about Homer. And it just became this kind of really holistic story of the women of the ancient world.
Did you sit down to write this when you were writing this book? Did you sit down specifically and say, I'm going to do this book, or did it come out of, were you doing research for other projects and then did you, like it just started building into something and you went, wait a minute, I'm I've got this plethora of information, and did it just kind of organically build, or did you set out to do it on purpose? You know what I
No,
mean?
I definitely set out to do it on purpose, and that's very much kind of also how I am. Like I love kind of to plan. I love to kind of know where I'm going. So, I basically was like I just had this kind of idea, and I kind of wrote down the first line of the book, and I was like I can immediately see how this is going to go. Now, at that point, what I had was the idea that the kind of the bringing together of these different angles, the real women behind Greek myth, that was the kind of eureka moment.
Mhm.
But what I didn't have was all of the individual discoveries that I would use. So I then kind of set about researching them. And one of the things that was just incredible about writing this book was that it everything just ended up slotting together in ways that I was finding discoveries for things that I hadn't even known were there, that were basically kind of speaking to Homeric characters that I could never have imagined. So it definitely, I mean, I'm not a superstitious person, but if I ever believed in the muses, this was an experience that would have made me believe in them because it just felt like everything just slotted together so seamlessly. It was pretty amazing.
And I have to say that reading the chapters, they're just one rolls into the other and you can just see this big connection. And I felt like, as somebody who really likes Greek mythology and the Bronze Age, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it's so easy to read and it's so relatable. And I
Thank
was
you.
wondering, I had a few chapters I was wondering if we could talk about. Would you mind sharing about Thetis? I this chapter really moved me about um women's the you said like the terror of giving birth, and that women um were as likely to die in childbirth as men, uh like on the battlefield, relating those to the harrowing experience of childbirth, like wartime, like what men experienced in war. And I just thought that was brilliant. And the grief, I just love Thetis. So maybe you could share a little bit about Thetis and the the things that you put together about her and Achilles.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think and it's fun actually that you picked her out because I think she's one of the chapters that maybe best exemplifies what I'm trying to do with Penelope's Bones, what I hope that the book does, and all of the different angles that it kind of brings together on women in the ancient world. So basically, we kind of start off by looking, and every single chapter starts off with, first of all, a kind of very brief, kind of fictional reimagining of each woman. And for Thetis, she is the mother of Achilles. She is an immortal goddess. Of course, as we all know, Achilles is very much mortal. He ends up dying because of the kind of fabled arrow in his Achilles heel, which Thetis tried to protect him from, right? So, like from the very beginning, she's got this kind of concern over his mortality. And it's the kind of ultimate juxtaposition, really, because you've got an immortal goddess and a mortal son. She knows he's going to die. And so I just start by kind of exploring that. We then go into an archaeological dig. And again, every single chapter opens with a dig. This one is one that was happening not too long ago in 2014 in Crete. And it's the discovery of the grave of a baby boy. And it's what's called an intramural burial, which means that the baby, the infant, has been buried under the floor of a home, which is really interesting and really striking because in general in the ancient world, you tend to see burials happening outside the walls for obvious reasons of kind of hygiene. But it's particularly infants in this period that start getting this treatment, which to me suggests that there is something going on, some deep sense of loss, some desire to keep these little lost babies with the families. And so I kind of start exploring, well, what is the evidence for the loss of children in the
Hmm.
late Bronze Age, which is the period that, we would be sort of, if we were looking for a historical period that Homer's epics were thinking back to, we'd probably be looking around the late Bronze Age. And the evidence, kind of as you picked out, is extraordinary. The amount of young infants of children and babies who died early on in their lives. The numbers are just staggering. In some cases, you get cemeteries that are just filled with babies and children. In others, we're looking at women who have died in childbirth. Again, a really shocking outlook for women, and the kind of average life expectancy for women much lower than it is for men in this period, because we are looking at women dying most likely through childbirth, men dying about age 34, which means that they're probably dying in war. So it's an incredible kind of reorientation, both of life and of death. It speaks to what women would have been concerned about, and you can see that in the kind of religious offerings that they are giving. But then for me, and this is the kind of final twist in the tale, it speaks to the Iliad. So the Iliad is, of course, Homer's epic of war. Traditionally, we would sort of refer to it as the story that tells the wrath of Achilles, um, and that's what the epic itself says it's doing. It opens with Achilles being very peeved and being out of the war, and he is kind of sulking on the edge of the battlefield because his glory has been taken away, his honor has been taken away from him by Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks. What's fascinating about it, though, is that as he sort of howls out his rage in the very first book of the Iliad, he calls for his mother.
Hmm.
And the goddess Thetis comes, and one of the first things she says to him is to lament how short-lived he is going to be. So
Hmm.
whenever she talks to him throughout the Iliad, and she makes multiple appearances, she is always talking about how he is fated to die. We see this again and again. First of all, there's a prophecy that she gives him, that he recounts at one point in the Iliad, where he says that his mother told him that if he goes home, he will have a long life, but if he stays here and gets glory at Troy, he is going to die, and have a short life. So she is sort of standing behind that the whole way through. And what's really interesting is when you reorientate the poem, not to be about the glory and the honor and the anger of a man, but to be about the grief of a mother who has to stand by and watch her son die. It is an extraordinary upending of the epic. And it was just that moment where kind of archaeology and myth and epic all come together to make you just see the past in a completely different way.
I thought of I think of Thetis, and I think you make reference to this in the chapter. She's gonna she's going to grieve forever. And
Yeah.
so when you have mortal women, just the idea, I have two kids and I have five grandkids. So if I thought of anything happening to any one of them, I feel like I would die. I don't know if I would just, I don't know if I could breathe anymore. And um to have like mothers and aunts and grandmothers burying children under the floorboards. I can't imagine what that would feel like. And I think, like what you're talking about is, keeping them close, because when you lose people that you care about, no matter the age, there is something about hanging on to the grief because that's all you have left,
Yeah.
and to keep the children close. And that Thetis, she's so, and you mentioned this in the chapter also, the different ways that the myth has her trying to make him immortal. or and then at the very last she just tries to hide him away, um she's gonna grieve forever.
Yeah,
There'll be no
absolutely.
end. There'll be no end to that. And that really, I think, speaks to motherhood, and
Yeah.
everything that you laid out in this chapter just really kind of hit me in the heart, on so many levels. Just that first part of a mother having to grieve, and then I and just the loss of life. And I want to come back to it because it just made me think right now, like, and then Hecuba had so many children,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know,
But then she
right?
also typically references the grief of her mother when she asks Hector not to fight Achilles, and she pulls
Yes.
out her breast and she reminds
Yes.
him of
Yes.
breastfeeding, right? This incredible
Yes.
moment in this kind of
Yes.
supposed military epic where a mother reminds her grown son on the battlefield that in fact once he was just an infant suckling at her breast. And she is appealing to him there as a mother and in anticipation of the fact that he is going to die.
And I think that's so human of her to do that, because when I look at my oldest grandson, just is 15 and a half, and my next grandchild is a granddaughter, and she had to babysit, and I was like, wait a minute, how old are you? And she's like, I'm 13. I'm like, wait, in August you're gonna be 14? And I just, you tend to, even when they're grown, and my grown children are grown, but it's still in my mind, I see them as young.
Yeah.
And I can see how Hecuba would, here's this grown warrior, a veteran on the battlefield, and yet I'm sure she looked at him and she pulls her breasts out, like, remember me, remember this, and that she still sees him as the little boy that she nursed and took care of.
Yeah.
I can't.
So I think there's also in there a reminder because of course we have seen a little boy earlier on in the Iliad, which is Hector's own son, Astyanax. And
Mhm.
it's a reminder that Hecuba, in fact, as a mother, is quite lucky that her son has got this far. Because of course Andromache and Hector will lose their son. He gets tossed off the walls of Troy in one of the kind of utmost acts of brutality from the Greeks.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
while there is a pathos to it, there is also a triumph as a mother to have raised your son this far to be the defender of Troy. So it's a real
Right.
double-edged sword, and it's something that Thetis sees as well, right? That her son, she knows he's fated to die. She hates it. She knows that actually if he stays in the war, he will meet his doom. But she can see that his glory, and for Hector, it's defending Troy. That's what matters to their sons. And so both of them, in the end, do support their sons in doing what they want to do, even if it ends up destroying them.
I even, you mentioned how, Hector had, and I don't know if it was in this. No, it wasn't in this chapter. It was in the Andromache chapter. So I'm kind of jumping ahead, but it's okay. Um, where when his mom offers him some wine when he comes off from the battlefield, and his is asking her to go make some offerings and prayers to Athena, right? And she's offering him the wine. He's like, nah, it's gonna mess me up on the fight when I get out there on the battlefield. And I think about, even in that moment, in the thick of fighting, when and he's all, dirty from the war, and she still does the mother thing. Are you hungry? Here's
Yeah.
something to drink. She's just very much a mother, and I can't imagine what she was going through, just knowing that every time your son leaves the gates and goes out and fights, is he coming back? And of
Yeah.
course Andromache has that, as the wife, she has that experience too. But um I think you do such a wonderful job of showing us what mothers were experiencing in the Bronze Age in this chapter.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you so much. I mean, for me, it was kind of one of the most powerful to write, also as a mother myself. But I think, in the way that it brought together all of those different experiences that Also, we don't tend to talk about, I mean, we were saying right at the beginning about kind of how archaeological discoveries can, if they're not kind of fleshed out, if they're not presented in with a kind of respect for the fact that these are real people and real bones and real cemeteries and real burials, it's very easy to just say like, okay, look, there are X many burials under the floors, and hey, look, like the measurement of this bone is like Y. But what does that actually mean? And I feel like for me, once I let myself start telling the story of these women, which is something that I think we don't do enough, is to color that picture in, it started becoming this incredible tragedy.
You mentioned in here the a couple of things, but the sippy cups. And
Yeah.
since we talked about the breastfeeding with Hecuba, that there it was um, a lot of babies weren't from the evidence breastfed maybe past the third month, and that there are little clay sippy cups. Could you share that
Yeah,
with
I mean, so this is one of the sort of pieces of evidence that seems to be coming out of the record, which is that there are some infant burials where they are being found with either kind of little versions of ancient Greek sippy cups with basically like little strainers on the lid, or just sort of little vessels, and it's possible to trace what those vessels were holding using kind of amazing chemical methods. And what they're discovering is that some of them have kind of combinations of a sort of honey, barley, and sort of opium. And so it suggests that these young children or infants who were probably very, very unwell
Mhm.
were being drugged and being given these kind of sedatives as a way to alleviate pain. But it's also interesting in that it demonstrates that they are not exclusively being breastfed already at quite an early stage. Now, if you look at the current WHO guidelines for breastfeeding, it's 2 years.
Mhm.
Um, and so you can see that, and you have to sort of piece together the puzzle to work out why. Was it because the infants were unwell and therefore not feeding well at the breast, which is why they were being given these other things, which ironically would have provided them with less of the resistance that breast milk would have done? Is
Mhm.
it that the mothers themselves were malnourished, which we know again from piecing together the evidence from both the teeth and the bones, but also from the written evidence of the time, where we can see that women systematically are being given less meat than men from a young age. And therefore, is it the mothers who are malnourished who therefore can't breastfeed to the same length that they would want to? Or is it most likely a combination of both? And the real kind of tragedy behind this, aside from obviously the fact that it's not protecting the infants in the way that they need it through breast milk, it's also the fact that breast milk has some contraceptive properties. And if the mothers weren't breastfeeding for whatever reason, it then meant that they were more likely to fall pregnant again, which meant that they were more likely to again initiate this cycle. So it's a kind of terrifying cycle of tragedies that we're seeing.
Right. And you talked also about how malnutrition was very prevalent in the Bronze Age, specifically for women, and that they
Mm.
had less meat in their diet than the men, and that it had an effect on like the formation of their pelvic bones,
Yeah.
and that would make childbirth even more dangerous for them at the time. Did you want to, can you elaborate on that for
Yeah,
us?
exactly. I mean, it's this issue that, if you have kind of systemic malnutrition of women from a young age, it means that the body is going to develop in different ways, and in this case, underdevelop if you don't have enough access to meat and protein. And so what we're seeing in again, and it's particularly in association with these kinds of worst case cemeteries where we see lots and lots of infant and child burials, you see the women's skeletons displaying a significantly narrowed birth canal, probably due to this lifelong malnutrition, which is probably connected to the numbers of infant deaths that we're seeing, in that, the women's bodies weren't properly prepared for childbirth. They are trying to give birth with a significantly narrower birth canal, which obviously makes it a lot harder. And then we've got all of these other issues around, if you're malnourished, you're also more likely to be prone to diseases and so on. Those could then be passed on to the infants, either in utero or when they're born. And yeah, we just got this kind of real difficult situation for women, that just makes this sound like an altogether terrifying prospect.
And what was the average age when women would be married and like have their first children?
We
Is
don't know about marriage, but in terms of the first child, you can see that in the mortuary record, and I believe it's 19.
19? Okay. We're not, I'm just trying to think of what the average age is like in the United States or in the UK. Do you know what I
Um,
feel
I don't actually know the modern figures. I think what is perhaps more striking is not the average age, which kind of on the face of it is okay, but it's below the optimal age of childbearing is the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is that the mortality rate is really quite low for women. I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it was maybe 24, 25. I don't have the figures. I remember it was 34 for men. It's somewhere in the 20s for women.
that's
Um,
so young.
oh, exactly. So it's not long after you've had your first child that you are going to then be likely also to die.
When I think about all the how many women have a C-section in our modern society, we have that as an option when a child is not fitting through the pelvis. And I can just imagine like how often that must have happened in the Bronze Age because they didn't there's no way to remedy that.
They have a specific goddess who I talk about in the book, called Eilithwia, who is the goddess of birth pains, labor pains, right? And it seems very specific to have a goddess, not just of childbirth, which is like Hera, but a specific goddess of birth pains.
Mhm.
And it shows that this was a real something that people would have been aware of. It's something that women would have worshipped her. They would have prayed for a safe delivery, for a good delivery. And again, going back to that comparison to war, it was one of these moments of incredible kind of synergy where, I came across this simile in the Iliad, and Homer's poetry, of course, is famous for these incredible similes that move you from the world of war into the world of peace or farming or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
this one is an open, dripping wound on the battlefield suffered by Agamemnon, king of the Greeks. I mean, it doesn't get much more masculine than that. And it is compared to the pains of labor when Eilithwia comes. So, an incredible comparison between a mortal wound in battle and the kind of biggest killer of children, of women there.
I made a note that um that Penelope, having with Odysseus being gone for 20 years, that kind of saved her from she wasn't going to have to experience, you know, dying from childbirth. I just made a note that that kind of in a way saved her, you
Yeah,
know.
it's an interesting point. Although we don't see, if you look at the kind of families of the heroes of Greek myth, we don't see kind of huge families. Whether that is a kind of testament to the fact that there were deaths, I don't know. But then, of course, like you don't also know exactly what was going on in Ithaca. Like I would, just because Odysseus is away, she's got all of these suitors and they have very specific ideas. So like, and Homer is very kind of keeping it close to the chest about what exactly happened between Penelope and the suitors. So
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
you did. You mentioned that in your Penelope
yeah,
chapter.
yeah.
This also made me think about in the Middle Ages how they didn't name the child until the first year. Did they have any tradition like did they not name children? And we know that from the Middle Ages where that was a big deal. I remember being in graduate school and um, learning that they would wrap babies up in swaddling cloth and then hang them from a peg on the wall and to
Right.
keep rats from, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was so mortified to learn that. And
Yeah.
but then they didn't give him a name, and I think that's where we get that tradition of the first birthday, it's a big deal, and that's when they would get a name. Did they have any traditions like that, or do you?
So in this period, it's really hard to know because the written records, which would be the only place where we would really see a record or something like that, they are these bureaucratic lists from the Mycenaean palaces. They're not giving us any kind of local customs. Once we get later on into kind of classical Greece, we do get kind of naming practices and naming rituals, but that's like hundreds of years later. So I'm not sure we could sort of push anything back into this period.
You have this great picture in her book. I'll have to. This is like the if you can see that, everybody, it's like the little sippy cup that we were talking about earlier.
And that
Um,
one's so special because that one was found in a house of potters. So they actually made this cup themselves. And so there is just like an extra layer as well that, they made this for this little infant who never made it beyond kind of the beginnings of their life. And also that it is obviously symbolic of the fact that this little person would never grow up to be a potter like they were. So there's a real pathos and tragedy to that gift.
yes, I wanted to go back to. I don't know why this is now popping into my head, but did you watch that the Netflix show Troy Fall of a City?
Yes.
Did you I That was kind of my first introduction to seeing that Odysseus and Penelope, they showed three children. Do you remember that?
Do you know what? It's ages since I saw it, and I don't remember that at all. All I
I
remember really was Helen of Troy. Yeah, I don't remember the Odysseus Penelope bit.
Penelope had a baby, and then he was taught, and Telemachus was like 5. And I was kind of, and I'm just going back to your comment you had said earlier about the heroes had like small families.
Yeah.
So I have not explored that. So but that just made me think of that. Was there anything else that you wanted to like bring up or say about Thetis and Achilles? You say Thetis, I say Thetis.
I feel like American and English pronunciation, particularly on classical words, is notoriously yeah, it's you can completely say it however you want. It's difficult because like there is a letter in the Greek alphabet, which is the eta, which in Americans will tend to pronounce as an E, as a long E, and
Mm.
Brits will tend to say air. Whereas the in Thetis is a short in the Greek. So like yeah, but it's like really it's up for grabs.
Okay. Uh, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been saying it wrong anyway, but that
Totally
makes
fine.
sense. Was there anything that we did not cover about Thetis
Um, I
and
mean, I
Achilles?
guess one of my kind of my favorite things about her that I kind of discovered as I was doing this was that, I knew that she talks a lot about having given birth to Achilles and the fact that he's going to die and all of that is interesting in and of itself in imagining an immortal goddess giving birth. That is an interesting kind of proposition. But she also, in the Greek, comes up with a very specific word for this, which is what Homeric scholars call a hapax legomenon, which means a once spoken. And that means that it is a word that only occurs this time in the entire corpus of ancient Greek literature that we have.
Wow.
And which is very, very cool.
Yeah.
It also means that it is a very unusual word. It means that it is possibly one that like wasn't maybe even in currency, and it's one that the poet kind of put together to express how Thetis was feeling and how unusual she was. And the word in Greek is dousaristotokeia, yeah, which means the worst and the best childbirther. And it's all one word. And basically, you've got the kind of the negative adjective, the positive adjective, and then you've got tokeia at the end, which means mother, but it literally it means a childbirther in the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that that's so fascinating as a way to try and articulate how she loves being his mom. She, feels so fortunate to have given birth to him, but she also knows that it is the worst thing that she's going to experience, right? And I feel like that's kind of, for me as a mom, I can really associate with that in that like the highs are the highest you will ever have and the lows are low. But
Right.
it's because you
Mm.
care so much.
Yeah.
And I just that word Dusarusotokea, that's really like kind of stayed with me because I think it's such a brilliant articulation of motherhood.
I love that. And I think that does encapsulate about being a mother. So
Mm.
all of the things that she experienced and all the things she knows she's going to experience sort
Yeah.
of um I'm not even sure what that would be like. The only thing I can think about would be when my father had cancer, and knowing that death was imminent, we just didn't know when.
Mm.
But living with that, it became like every phone call and like is this it? You know, I think Thetis must have been going through that she knew that that his end was going to come quickly at some point, but she didn't know exactly when.
Which is so hard. I'm not going to
Mhm.
say it's worse, but it's really
It's
hard.
it's an anticipation of it's like that feeling of impending doom that
Yeah.
you can't get away from, and then knowing that the doom is associated with your child.
Mhm.
I don't know like how you move past that. I do find it interesting that as a goddess, she was not spared birthing pain.
A really interesting example of that, which I think I talk about in the chapter, which is it's not in Homer, but it's in a hymn that was ascribed in antiquity to Homer. So they're called the Homeric hymns, probably not by the same poet as the Iliad, if the Iliad was indeed by one poet at all. But there is one which is the Homeric hymn to Apollo, and it details Apollo's birth. And from his side of it, it's brilliant. It's like a very divine birth in that he pops out and he jumps straight up and he's already walking and like, but from the woman's side, from Leto, who's his mother, for her, it's insanely difficult because Hera, who is jealous of her, basically gets Eilithwia, the goddess of birth pains, and holds her back. So Leto can't give birth. And, so she's really kind of straining and trying. And eventually she kind of finds a place where she can do it. And she sits down at the base of a tree and she finally gives birth. But it's this extraordinary example of like prolonged labor. And it's
Mm.
a goddess. So yeah, I think the goddesses don't get a good time of it, even if Apollo pops out and has a great birth.
Right. And the only one, I guess, and that's not fair because Athena pops out of Zeus's head, right?
Does, yeah.
And so
He
Zeus has
doesn't,
no
he doesn't have labor pains. Mind
that's
you,
just that's not fair.
he has to cut his head off with an axe, and that's got to hurt a little bit, hasn't
Okay,
it?
okay. Call it a wrap on this one.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Right.
great. Well, it will be nice to come back and talk about women of the Odyssey.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you picked out Thetis because, like, of the Iliad
She's
women,
my
she's
she's my
definitely,
favorite.
yeah,
I
yeah.
remember just thinking just a lot of the research that I had done, I just really thought how she encapsulates the grief of motherhood. And and I kind of lean to like the tragic stuff because that's
Mm.
I mean there's the joyous stuff, but it's the joy comes only when you have the opposite, grieving forever. It reminds me of Arwen and Lord of the Rings, and so we have these little glimpses of that mother's mother's grief, and parent grief of losing a child is, I think it's probably the worst.
Yeah. Yeah.
I so anyway, Thetis was kind of my favorite.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm yeah, really, really glad. But yeah, no, it was really fun.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. That's it for today's episode, Myrmidons. A huge thank you to Dr. Emily Hauser for joining me and sharing her incredible insight into the life and legacy of Thetis and how archaeology and science have shed light on one of the most complex and compelling goddess mothers in Greek mythology. If today's conversation sparked something in you, I highly recommend her new book, Penelope's Bones. It is a brilliant fusion of archaeology and myth and historical imagination that brings Bronze Age women into the spotlight where they belong. And speaking of Penelope, don't miss our next episode where Dr. Hauser will be back to talk about the Queen of Ithaca herself, the wife, the weaver, survivor, and the strategist. Until then, thank you for listening and watching. And as always, drink your wine and be merry, Myrmidons.